Thank you so much. That was great, wonderful. And the jingle, it's better than, I'm Sioux City is, the railroad town that I was familiar with growing up in Northwest Iowa. And I think your jingle has theirs beat, but I don't want to upset any Sioux City people here, though. So wonderful. Well, thank you. We're going to move right on to our last presentation today. That's by Ryan Roenfeld. And Ryan is going to be presenting Kanesville to Council Bluffs and How the West Went Wild. Ryan is a sixth-generation resident of Southwest Iowa, former president of the Historical Society of Pottawattamie County, and a graduate of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. His most recent book is Secret Omaha, published by Reedy Press. So join me in welcoming Ryan.
I could get that jingle out of your head because Bill DeFries also wrote Convoy. And thank you, and if you hit me up afterward, I will sell you a copy of that book for cash in the parking lot out of my car. So what happened? Unfortunately, a lot of it got given away. What was the major thing in the transformation of log cabins of Kanesville to the city of Council Bluffs? It was gold! It was gold that was discovered in California in 1848 at Sutter's Mill. And it really kind of set up a boom and bust cycle that the community would experience till actually the railroads were completed. So in the spring, thousands of people would be crowded into Council Bluffs, waiting for the grass to grow enough on the Great Plains to go west. After that, the place would be practically deserted the rest of the year. It would forever change the social, political, and economic of this area forever. At least until last year when they completed the I-80 Express, which is just incredible that the city now lets people just drive through Council Bluffs without stopping and leaving their money behind. I don't know whose idea that was, but yeah. So 1849, Kanesville is only a year old, and that was the year the isolated jump-off points along the Missouri River were inundated. These were very isolated places out west. They did not have large populations, and all of a sudden, all of America wanted to go through them, buy up a lot of bacon, and go west and get rich. One of the first that opened up that year was a Jewish guy named Saul Bloom, opened up an outfitting store. It was these outfitting places that would throng these people headed west. They all had very interesting perceptions of what early Kanesville looked like. A guy named George Jewett called it a scrubby town of 80 to 100 log cabins. And all these were right along in what had been Caldwell's Village, along Indian Creek, pretty much what is now East Broadway. What happened between Caldwell's death and the arrival of the Mormons? What was left? Nobody knows. At least nobody that I can find has known. So all these gold seekers come to town, so you know what the city of Kanesville did? It built its first jail, 18-foot square. It was also the year the Mower and Sanford stage line started. And it's got to remember that you have hundreds of miles of empty prairie between these isolated settlements on the Missouri and the rest of Iowa. Everything mostly was directed south towards Missouri. The steamboats came upriver from Missouri. The first stage line went south to Missouri. It was a lot easier to go south down to St. Joe than it was to go east. There wasn't really anything much east till you got to Fort Des Moines anyway. One could argue the same today if you've been on I-80 east of Council Bluffs. So by October of 1849, the town had grown to having 6 stores, 4 wagon shops, and 2 blacksmiths. A guy named Judge Horace Deemer later called it a cosmopolitan population, coming from God knows where. Adventurers, soldiers of fortune, traders, hunters, gamblers, and the usual nondescript class found on the outposts of civilization. While the Mormons had arrived here to practice their own religion, the more new arrivals came here for one reason only, and that was to make money any way they could. So 1850 rolls around, and that March the gold diggers had already started to throng the streets. Of course, there was supply and demand. 100 pounds of flour cost $250, and that's back when $250 actually was worth something. The Tootle brothers came up from St. Joe and opened up the elephant store. Of course, you could go, seeing the elephant was a phrase in the 19th century about seeing a fantastic thing. So why not call your store the elephant store and sell everything under the sun for whatever you can get out of people who would be out of town shortly. 8 to 10,000 people were camped out on the river bottoms that year just waiting to cross the river. You could only get so many wagons on a ferry at a time. That year also brought conflict. A guy named William Dresser called Kanesville a mean Mormon hole. A lot of the new rivals had no love for the Mormons. A lot of them were the reasons they got chased out of Missouri and out of Nauvoo. And here they were around them again. There were also frequent accusations of price gouging, but again, everything was about supply and demand. On the other hand, a guy named Loyal Waterhouse called the Mormons honest and upright. So by June of 1850, 4,500 wagons had crossed the Missouri River here. There was so much people headed west to the gold fields of California, it actually forced the Mormons south to a new settlement called Bethlehem. And from 1850 to 52, most Mormons were crossing the Missouri River down near essentially where the Burlington Bridge is down at Plattsmouth, Nebraska. Now, by 1851, the non-Mormon character of Kanesville continues to change. The Methodists and Congregationalists opened up their own churches, which they shared in a log cabin. There was also the start of the Plumer settlement, southeast of Council Bluffs, as the Mormons, as they left gradually for the west, were replaced largely by the Germans. A lot of them, basically where the Plumer settlement was part of which was Orson Hyde's farm, southeast of town. A lot of the Mormons sold off their claim to Germans, who began to arrive a lot in the 1850s. Now, it was the end of that year when Brigham Young called all the faithful west. Kanesville was quickly cheap as dirt. People wanted to sell out and get out. Now, of course, there was also an estimated 2,000 Mormons who dropped off the Mormon Trail and stayed in southwest Iowa, as I mentioned earlier, including my great-great-great-grandfather. So after getting run out of Kirtland, getting run out of Missouri, and then Nauvoo, I guess he just would rather stay here, and did. And 175 years later, we're still here. So it was 1852 that really made Kanesville the place to cross the Missouri River. It was that year more overland traffic crossed the Missouri River at Kanesville than anywhere else. Not Independence, not St. Joe. You got to remember, the further north you went up the Missouri River, the further west you were. It was a 6-week wait that spring to cross the Missouri River, which was busy flooding. In fact, that was the year it pretty much ended what had been Trader's Point down around the mouth of Mosquito Creek. We talked about that in the last session. By that year, Kanesville had grown to having 300 houses, 5 hotels, and 8 wagon shops. Again, the entire economy largely revolved around supplying people that were headed west. That was also the year a man named Sam Bayless arrived. And Sam Bayless was a Virginia colonel. He was traveling up on the steamboat Saluda, and he believed that steamboat was unsafe, and he got off around Lexington, Missouri, and traveled the westward way overland. And it's a good thing he did, because the boilers on the Saluda blew up, and it was the worst accident of any steamboat on the Missouri River, and it killed a lot of Mormon immigrants that were headed up to Kanesville. So there's only about 1,000 people left in town by the end of that year. The population had dropped significantly when the Mormons mostly left. They got together and they decided to rename the place Council Bluffs City. Because, of course, if you put a city on the end of your name, you're going to be a city. It didn't work. 1853, the Iowa legislature shortened it to just Council Bluffs. Now, since this was all land squatter titles, they could not be taxed. So how does the city make any money? Well, what you do is you get kickbacks from every saloon, every gambler, and every prostitute. These things are not, these things are against the law, but the point is not to stop them. The point is for a continued municipal revenue, month after month after month. This is basically, it's called the blind licensing system. And it would continue in Council Bluffs and across the river in Omaha till well into the 20th century. The city's also got its first mayor, a guy named Cornelius Voorhees. Voorhees was a know-nothing. Not that he didn't know anything, he was a member of the Nativist American Party. And the thing that the American Party hated the most? Germans and Catholic Irish immigrants. They could never become real Americans. They would destroy this country forever. We must do everything to stop them. Because, of course, they always say the same thing about immigrants over and over and over. So about 2 months in office, Cornelius resigned. The city had no money. It was a mess. You couldn't be mayor of a town that you couldn't, didn't have any treasury. Municipal government in Council Bluffs pretty much collapsed for the next 2 years. It was a free-for-all. In that November of 1853, fire burned up downtown, and whatever remnants were left of old Kanesville. That was the year Dexter Bloomer, Amelia Bloomer's husband, the Bloomers? Yeah, those folks. He claimed every available building was ere long converted to a gambling and drinking hall. Again, that was the only way anybody made any money. A guy named William Gilbert passed through that year and called it the poorest and meanest dirty hole I ever saw. A man named John Studebaker played his first game of three-card monte in Council Bluffs. He lost everything but his shirt and 50 cents. Studebaker would later make it back on wagons and automobiles, though. Any of you guys know how to play three-card monte? It was played on every street corner in town. All you got to do is you got 3 cards. You just got to pick out the queen. It's a real easy game, very simple, really easy to win. It was a scam then. It's a scam today, although probably the only place you're going to find it is outside the Port Authority bus terminal in New York City. Don't play. It's full of shills. Chuck-a-Luck, Keno, and Pharaoh. Pharaoh was a very popular game at this time in the Old West. So was 7-Up. You know what nobody really played much of? Poker. All those Western TV shows and movies were nothing but lies. That was also the year a 16-year-old named Baltimore Muir was traveling west with a wagon train, and he got greedy. So he decided to kill another guy with an axe, just chopped him up right there in his tent. And that's when the rest of the people he was traveling with got together and decided that he was guilty. And they took that 16-year-old up a hollow and they hung him dead. They called that Hangman's Hollow. That's now Glen Avenue today. That was also the year some Council Bluffs businessmen got together, as you might have heard earlier, and they organized the Council Bluffs and Nebraska Ferry Company. They would take over ferrying the immigrants across the Missouri River. One of the members of the ferry company was Sam Bayless, who had also opened up a new hotel called the Pacific House Hotel. This was after he bought up Mormon Henry Miller's squatter claim, 400 acres for $250. That was a pretty good deal. That is essentially most of downtown, what became downtown Council Bluffs today, which was west of old uptown Kanesville along East Broadway. So much money. He even made so much money, he decided that he would give a plot of that land to the county to build a new courthouse. Because, of course, where you ever have the courthouse, whoever owns the lots around it's going to make even more money. But by the time that happened, Virginia colonels were out of fashion after the Civil War, and it became a park. And it's still a park, Bayless Park today. So as at the end of 1853, another city continued to transform. That's when Peter Day and his 22-year-old assistant, Grenville Dodge, arrived during their survey for the Mississippi and Missouri River Railroad. That really would set up the next stage of development. So by 1854, Council Bluffs only had a population of 978 people left. That was the year the city was finally legally platted by an immigrant from the Guernsey Islands named Thomas Tostovan. Once it was legally platted, you could get legal title. Legal title could be taxed. The city could have a source of income again. Yay! That was also the year the schemes of Council Bluffs finally culminated, of course, in the new city built across the river to the west. That was the year the Kansas-Nebraska Act was pushed through by Stephen Douglas. What county is Omaha in? It's in Douglas County. Who was the Iowa senator who got that act passed through Congress? His name was Augustus Dodge. What's the main drag through Omaha? It's Dodge Street, named not after Grenville, but Augustus. So, and of course, as Dr. Warner mentioned, Francis Burt was named the first territorial governor, died 2 days after taking the oath of office. Not a bad thing, because he was a South Carolina slave owner. So the city would develop a little bit differently than that. Thomas Cumming, of course, has been mentioned. And the real connection that Nebraska and Omaha particularly always leave out is that Cumming had most recently lived in Keokuk, but before that he lived in Michigan. And he had served in the Mexican-American War. And his commanding officer was a guy named Andrew Jackson Hanscom. Now, Hanscom had also intended to go out west, and he wound up in Kanesville in 1849, but he arrived too late in the year. You know what happens when you take off across the plains too late in the year? You get the Donner Party cookbook. So Hanscom stayed here, and he opened a store, and he did some lawyering, and then once that new city popped up, and one of his guys who had served over him was in charge, Hanscom moved right across the river, became the first speaker of the House of Representatives of Nebraska Territory. Cumming, like Sam Bayless, they all were bound and determined to make Omaha the metropolis of Nebraska, to bring the railroads in through Council Bluffs by any means fair and foul. They even doled out city lots to other Nebraska territorial legislators just to get them to vote for Omaha City. And of course, it worked. Nebraska City, Plattsmouth, those are dinky small towns of nothing. Omaha, though, Omaha's a real city and still is today. But that is, I guess, a story for a different time. So thank you. So, and I apologize for the lack of pretty pictures.
Well, thank you so much. That was great. We've had 3 wonderful presentations, and we are right on time. And so we have 15 minutes left for questions. And we'll open it up to the group. What I'd ask is that you say your question loudly. I will then repeat it so that those who are joining us on Zoom are able to hear it. And then I just ask our presenters to speak into the microphone when they are answering. So our first question, yeah. So the question is, can we talk a little bit about how the name Council Bluffs, where it originated from? So I'll turn it over to our panelists.
Hello, test. Is this on?
I think it was on.
I think it, and I probably just accidentally turned it off. Yes.
Yeah.
Council Bluffs came because it was a region. It was not a point, it was a region. But the state legislature of Iowa in 1852 determined that the M&M Railroad would terminate in Council Bluffs. So, in a slick, incredibly cool, albeit possibly unethical, backhanded way, our city ditched Kanesville and took Council Bluffs as our name. So instead of being a region, it now became a point. And so even though that wasn't the legislature's intent, there now is a law on the books in the state of Iowa that says the railroad has to come to Council Bluffs. And I think I learned that from Troy Stolp. Am I correct on that, Troy? Okay.
Does that answer your question, or did you want to know where the actual phrase Council Bluffs? So the phrase, why did they choose it?
Oh, yeah, okay, I'm sorry. The Lewis and Clark Council, and it is many times used in the singular, Council Bluff, and sometimes you'll see it on Council Bluffs, but you'll see that pop up all over the maps, particularly on the Nebraska side, but also prior to our taking it throughout that region. But yeah, it was presumably named because of the council that Lewis and Clark had with the Native Americans in the area around Fort Calhoun.
And they were, the Native Americans, they mentioned, were what nation?
Odo, Missouri.
Odo, Missouri?
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, another question here in the back.
Do we know where the main ferry was that went across the Missouri River?
So the question is, do you know where the main ferry was that was crossing the Missouri?
Yes and no. There was actually 3 ferries right around here. There was a ferry down where the Bellevue Bridge is. There was briefly a ferry near where the South Omaha Bridge is. The river moved, and it moved a lot. So a lot of times the ferry points would move right along with it. So you can get kind of a general area. As far as the ferry between what was Council Bluffs and very early Omaha, pretty much ended up west over on Davenport Street, but took off more or less down near anywhere between Avenue B and First Avenue. So not far from, the West Broadway Bridge.
Terrific, great. Other questions? Yeah, right here. So the question is, can we talk a little bit more about Traders Point and its significance for history?
So it was actually, it was originally the Point of Pool. And back during the 1790s, the French traders who came up out of Spanish St. Louis would go along the Platte on horseback. And they would bring the furs back down from the Rocky Mountains, generally in boats, buffalo boats. And the Point of Pool became kind of a broad area down around the mouth of the Mosquito Creek, which was further south than it is today. And it was kind of a Native American Creole village. There was no essentially streets or downtown. It was scattered little settlements and farms. It had a variety of names. It was Louse Point. It was St. Francisville. For a while, it was Nebraska in 1849, and then after that, it became Council Bluffs for a while. And then it all flooded away and washed away, and there's a lot of soybean fields there now.
Very good. Other questions? Then I will oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to, we've got an audience here. We've got to throw in a free plug for if you like the Council Bluffs stories. We do have a podcast called Accidentally Historic. As you can see, a lot of our history is accidental. And if you don't remember the name, just go to your podcast host and put in Council Bluffs History. We also have a YouTube channel called Council Bluffs Revealed. And when I say we, that's the Historical Society. And our most popular video are these two guys, Ryan and Troy Stolp, talking about that tale of Council Bluffs being the capital of Omaha, and you talk about Lake Manawa, and we got some other things. So it's all some good free history there that's easy to listen to. And you really selling books out of your trunk?
Hell yeah, man.
Oh, I thought so. All right. Well, so don't forget the books in Ryan's trunk.
Perfect.
They're good books. I have a complete collection.
I want to ask a question, and maybe, I don't know if each of you could speak to it, or what I'm thinking about a lot is it seems that the Mormon experience is central to Council Bluffs, but what I keep thinking about is how different the Mormon experience seems to be here in Council Bluffs than it is, say, in Nauvoo or in other places in the East. And do you have any sense of why it is that the community is, one, not running folks out of town in the same way that, could this is, really an exodus, right, from Illinois. And so what's making it different? Is it the nowhereness, Janice, that you talked about? Is there something else that you all see at play? What makes this experience in Council Bluffs so different than the experience on the other side of the state of Iowa? Because Nauvoo is, of course, just across the Mississippi.
Well, is it on? Oh,
Yep.
The part that I skipped over to get to the end of my story, I said that the Mormons had problems in New York State, they had problems in Ohio State, they had problems in Missouri, and in fact, that anybody could kill them in Missouri at one point by order of the governor, and forgot to take that off the books for many, many years. And so in analyzing that in my story, it came down to need, because they needed themselves, but they didn't need to serve others. And so for Council Bluffs, they had all of this experience outfitting their own wagon trains going west, and then along comes the gold seekers and the people from Europe who were still going west. All of those people needed to be outfitted for the trip, and they were equipped to do that. So there was a very strong need for them right here for the services that they could provide to everybody. And they had were highly skilled at doing it after having done it for themselves for so many years. And that's me making up a story. I'm sorry, but it just kind of, when you analyze it, that does seem to be a good reason that they didn't get kicked out. Iowa didn't kick them out. Iowa's the only the only state, yay, Iowa, that didn't tell them to get lost. And I think that's why, because they were really needed for their what they could offer to everybody along the route. Because they're going across the river, there was nobody. And somebody tried to convince me a couple of years ago that Omaha existed before Council Bluffs, and I said, you guys, you got that wrong. So, but anyway, I think the whole thing is just neat.
Any other thought? I mean, that makes sense to me, but any other thoughts? I want to.
It was largely a safe haven.
Yeah.
Kanesville was the first place that practiced polygamy in the open, which had been very much not in the open in Nauvoo, but out here, who's going to say anything but some French-speaking fur traders? So I think they really felt for the first time that they could do what they want and no one was going to bother them. Again, there is no other, you're really Americans till you got east to Fort Des Moines.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really, to me, it's so interesting. Because I've studied a lot of history, right? But there's a lot of talk about Council Bluffs is often skipped over in some ways in the narratives that are told about U.S. religious history in more broadly.
See, she won't do anything west of Des Moines. Come on, look at the Western Historic Trail Center.
Yeah.
It's a good thing Mayor Walsh didn't show up to this today.
Yeah. I see another question.
There would have been no. Yes, but there was grass. The counties weren't organized. There was no settlements. There was a place called Indian Town out now where Lewis is, by Little Miami's village. But other than that, you really had lots of grass, buffalo and elk, between the time you got from Fort Des Moines till you got to the Missouri River around Council Bluffs.
My family is from Northwest Iowa. They homesteaded in Cherokee County around this time, and we have a card on the back, and it just says nothing here but elk and grass. You know, that there really was. They arrived in that time period, and yes, it was Iowa technically, but there was, I think they had to go to Fort Dodge, which was a multi-week trip.
Until the railroad got built, like there was no Atlantic or Red Oak. Any of those towns came in later with the railroads.
Another question? They provided the materials for agriculture. Yeah, that. Right, it's at that point that even though there was no maybe permanent European or American settlements, there was an environment, an ecosystem that existed that would eventually sustain and make a way for those kinds of developments. So. We have just a minute or two left, but any other questions or thoughts? We are right up headed to lunch now, so I am going to give you 3 minutes extra to make our way over for lunch. But thank you so much again to our presenters. This is really wonderful. Really enjoyed it.
And thank you, Andrew.
He did, yes. He retired.